The Holocaust was such a horrific event in history that it makes it difficult to fathom or understand, especially for younger ages. However, I really think Orly Yadin and Sylvie Bringa's animated short film Silence tackles this sensitive, unimaginable topic in such an effective way. Many artists, writers, and filmmakers who attempt to discuss or teach about the Holocaust are criticized because they either use poetic and stylistic elements that overshadow the horrors of the tragedy, or they use fiction to amplify the events that distract from the reality of the situation. For example, Art Spiegelman's Moz was heavily criticized and even banned in some areas because he contorted the Holocaust into a graphic novel where Jewish people are portrayed as mice while the Nazis were portrayed as cats, which many people thought was dehumanizing. In his defense, he expresses that the reason he uses animals to represent the Nazi and Jewish people is because young people would not have been able to really process or digest the extreme horrors of the Holocaust if he would have used real individuals and faces and created corresponding images. Similarly, Disney's Boy in the Striped Pajamas tells the story of a high-ranking Nazi family, but the youngest son, being innocent to the reality, becomes friends with a young Jewish prisoner in a concentration camp, and they talk on opposite sides of a barbed wire fence, believing he was just a boy in pajamas. So at the end of the film, he digs a tunnel so they can play together for once, which happens to be the day the Nazis were doing the gas chambers. Viewers see the screen fill with smoke, and the Nazi family realizes what had happened. But many people critique this story because ultimately at the end, viewers feel sympathy for the Nazi family instead of the hundreds that just died in that gas chamber and the Holocaust in general. On the other hand, Silence comes from a first-hand perspective, uses animation to explore the complexity of her memories and trauma that she experienced as a child, and makes the point that you should not stay silent. And saying your story can be such a liberating milestone to overcome forms of trauma and suppression, which everyone can relate to and learn to today in regards to speaking out against racism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination. For starters, what makes this story so effective and productive is that it is a first-hand perspective. Instead of using fiction or personification to fabricate these elements of the Holocaust that are already beyond the scope or standards that people can typically see as nonfiction, the audience easily is able to follow along and understand Tana's story because as she walks through the different stages of her life, we are on the same page as her. So when it begins with her being torn away from her mother and having to stay hidden with her grandmother during her childhood, we see from her point of view, being confused of the world around her and only aware that she has to live in secret to be safe. Then, when she is brought to Sweden to grow up and starting to become aware of how traumatic her experiences were in the corruption of the Holocaust, the audience wants to understand more and wants Tana to express how she feels. But it is impossible because she is constantly reminded not to speak of the past and to pretend like everything is normal. Finally, after she is sent back to Germany, she is given the letters from her mother on the train. Viewers, just like Tana, have a hard time bridging the past to the present and coming to terms with reality, especially after being told to disregard it for so long. At the end of the film, we hear the resolution of her story and understand how long it took for her to overcome the trauma and suppression because she explains how it took 50 years for her to say her story. Using this film in the classroom, teachers can provide students with a real account of a Holocaust survivor and have them understand more about the stages of trauma by examining life through Tana's eyes. Because oftentimes this subject is so hard to imagine that when it is talked about in such a wide-scale manner, it's hard to perceive. So being able to put a voice and a face to this moment in history makes it a little more easier to comprehend. With that being said, the film still uses creative film and animation work to make the story approachable, engaging, as well as informative. Some words and descriptions just could not do the reality of the Holocaust and her memories justice. So in this case, the animation manages to express some of Tana's complicated feelings and parts of her story that are difficult to convey in words. To be reminded of the Holocaust was a real event, and a tragedy felt above and beyond just her account. The film begins and ends with footage of that time period. When Tana explains her life in Germany as a child, in hiding with her grandmother and being torn away from her mother, all of the animations are done in this dark black and white cartoons. So when Tana is finally able to move and flee to Sweden, the animation changes to bright, colorful cartoons to symbolize how this was a new chapter in her life and the contrast in the environment, such as we see when Dorothy lands in Munchkinland and the film changes from black and white to Technicolor. Although this is a much happier period of her life, it did not mean those worries or that everything was suddenly okay, which is why after she explains how it was forbidden to talk about this situation and begins to explain how much of an outsider she felt when people would ask her about her exotic name, the film shows Swedish kids glowing, which is illustrated right now on the screen, to show their privilege of having a normal life. Behind the children, there is a man with a scary mask on who in the shadow transitions into a rat, demonstrating how the threat was not gone and that she still needed to be fearful of being exposed, while Tana narrates how she was still invisible and the best at hiding. Viewers watch as she grows and is placed inside of a suitcase to show how she was still a prisoner of her baggage of the past. After explaining how the film combines storytelling and animation to represent memories, Jessica Copley simplifies the effect, saying, "This conscious emphasis encourages the audience to search beyond the artifice in order to discover what lies in the ellipses between the spoken and the unspoken." End quote. On Tana's way back to Germany, she reads the letters that she was finally given from her family from her mother. As she reads, she imagines her mother's experiences while writing it. The film returns back to the black and white animations, which reiterates how grim life was at that time. Now that Tana has the information that was held back from her for so long about the events of the past on the train all at once, it forces her to come to reality about the Holocaust and the events of the past. So the film transitions into actual footage of train tracks, stressing the surreal moment she was having at that time. After being so conditioned to suppress her feelings and her past, she discusses how she was still not able to talk about her trauma for 50 years. As the film concludes with watching the train tracks go by, implying the distance she had to still go to overcome her wounds, by using silence to increase students' understanding of the Holocaust, teachers could implement visual and audio analysis activities such as answering critical thinking questions about the particular images displayed in the film, the changes in the film's medium and format, or the contrast between what she was saying and what was being shown, which will add multiple layers to the way they perceive the Holocaust since it compiles multiple insights from storytelling, audio, visuals, as well as their prior knowledge. Although learning about the Holocaust is important regardless, the film still offers valuable lessons that everyone can learn from, which is to not let society suppress you or your story. As I mentioned earlier, Tana states at the beginning and end of the film that it took her 50 years to say this story, illuminating how difficult it is to word or express those experiences, especially after being told to be silent for so long. In Tana Mount's article, In the Spirit of Reconciliation, she justifies learning about the Holocaust and personal for personal and current day significance, saying, if the Holocaust is being taught about, it means revealing the truth about the past, but as well showing how the same mechanisms operate in the world here and now in different societies and in man himself. Considering the genocide that is happening around the country and how racism, classism, fascism, sexism, and other forms of oppression that are tolerated, this is very true. By bringing silence into the classroom, teachers have the ability to open discourses with students about current injustices happening in the world and their personal experiences with trauma, discrimination, and suppression, which will build empathy and help prevent tragedies like the Holocaust from ever happening again. To wrap up my thoughts on silence, I just want to emphasize all the layers and opportunities that are compacted into just an 11-minute video, which is a factor that many teachers may be drawn to. Along with their prior knowledge, the oral storytelling in combination with the visual aspects in the short film open so many doors to activities in the classroom for dissecting and analyzing those components, while at the same time learning about a topic that is so significant in our history and a tragedy we can learn from today. By learning about the Holocaust, teachers can provide students with a skill set to show empathy, display the value of speaking your story, understanding trauma in its stages, and discover how the root of these problems are present in society now through forms of oppression that can and should be combated. With that being said, there are too many reasons for the Holocaust to be taught thoroughly in education systems, but still there are certain cautions and sensitivity actions that teachers should take and consider before diving into these subjects. For the same reasons that Anne Frank's A Diary of a Young Girl is so prominent in schools, silent manages to provide the same benefits of having first-hand experiences, but in a video format that allows animation and audio tools to express matters that are too difficult to word or express. I hope this podcast has sold this source to teachers out there who are either looking for supplementary material to go along with a Holocaust unit or to enrich in a unit focused on Anne Frank as the anchor text, or I hope that it has helped teachers to solidify their intent on implementing lessons focused on the Holocaust and the tragedy.